Hi, I'm Rachel Baumberger with Eerdmans Publishing. I'm here today with John Barclay, who is author of Paul and the Gift. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
This book is, I think it's been called groundbreaking, a game changer, all sorts of lovely things. Well done.
Thank you.
And you, in the book, look at the concept of grace as it relates to Paul. And this has been a subject on which much ink has been spilled.
Yeah.
What led you to dive into this book?
I think two things really. One was that I felt ever since I did my initial research on Paul a long time ago, 25 years ago, I felt there was an element of Paul's theology that had been left to one side, and that was this central theme of grace. It was just for a number of reasons, it just wasn't it had moved to the edge of discussion of Paul, and I felt there was something being missed. We were very good at analysing the social effects of Paul's theology. We weren't very good at analysing its sort of central driver, and so that was I had this feeling for a while that needed to be re-examined. And the second thing was I got interested in the anthropology of gift. I realized that to understand grace, we need to understand how gifts work in antiquity, and talked to various theologians who were interested in the theme of gift. It's a hot topic in contemporary philosophy and contemporary theology, and started reading some of the anthropology of gift and got really fascinated by it. And I could see a way of putting the two together in this book.
It's interesting that you have brought this new perspective. You say grace was everywhere in Second Temple Judaism. We often think of Paul talking about grace as being this really radical idea, but it has a context. You say grace was everywhere, but it was not everywhere the same.
Yes.
What do we learn about grace and gift from studying the context of the time?
Yes. Well, the first question I'm really trying to ask in this book is, what do we mean by grace? Because we use this term, but
it's such a short word.
It's such a short word, and but we each pour our own content into it, and we each, and I think one of the ways to understand a lot of disputes in Christian history is that theologians are using the same term, but they're meaning different things by it. And so I've tried to draw out the different senses in which this word can be used, the different elements of gift that are, as I say, perfected. And then I realized that it's the old way of speaking about Paul and Judaism was like, well, there's no one really talks about grace in Second Temple Judaism. It's Paul as a theologian of grace. And since the work of Ed Sanders in the 1970s, we've realized that's wrong, that's a caricature, and there is grace much talked about, God's mercy, God's love, God's grace, much talked about in Second Temple Judaism. What we hadn't really seen was, yes, the theme is talked about, but it's understood in different ways in different Jewish texts. And that's what I'm trying to do, to put Paul not as a kind of unique figure who's totally different from his fellow Jews, but neither is he simply saying the same as all his fellow Jews. It is actually a kind of contested, debated topic, how to understand God's goodness or God's grace.
So to take that thought further, then once we situate Paul within his context, when he talks about grace and about gift, what does it mean? Yes,
so I think the really distinctive thing for Paul, and this won't come as a surprise to those who know the Protestant tradition, but it's important to see in its context, the distinctive thing about Paul is he understands grace as a gift given without regard to the worth of the recipient. It's not just about given to sinners, but given without regard to ethnic worth or social worth or any of the normal human categories by which we measure our worth. And it's that notion of a gift that normally in the ancient world, for good reasons, one gives gifts discriminately to people who, by some criterion or another, their intelligence or their gender or their status or whatever, are worthy of the gift, because you give gifts lavishly but discriminately. And for Paul, the essence of what I call the Christ gift is that it's given without regard to worth, and that has radical implications for who belongs to this community and how you operate as a community.
That's really good news.
Yes, it is very, very liberating news. Yeah.
I think one of the things that you try to untangle in this book is the ways in which sort of Western thought has made grace into this idea of a gift with no strings attached.
Right.
What would Paul have thought about that?
Yes, we've developed in modern Western thought a kind of an ideal of a gift that is, if it's really a perfect gift, it should expect nothing back. And that's a very, I think, in terms of the history of culture and in terms of where Western culture compared to other cultures is actually a very peculiar way of developing the notion of gift. In most periods of time and in most cultures, it's obvious that if you give a gift and you're trying to create a relationship by giving a gift, and that relationship is a two-way relationship. You're hoping for, you can't demand a return, but you're hoping for something to emerge from it. So I think, and Paul, I think, is not a modern Western in that sense. God's gift to us are designed to create a relationship. The return, if you like, if you want to put it in those terms, is of thanks or faith or gratitude, and also a life that is transformed by the gift into a way of serving God, or a way of living in accordance with God's will.
So we have a gift that is given without regard for worth.
Yes.
But that does have some expectation attached to it.
Exactly. Yes, it isn't cheap grace in the sense that it's given and then God doesn't care what we do with it, because it's precisely given for our benefit, which is that our benefit is that we should be restored to relationship with God, and that relationship has a shape, has an order. So it's given without regard to our prior worth, but it's also given expecting the return, which is not, if you like, for God's benefit as such, but it's for our benefit. What we, as Paul says, I appeal to you by the mercy of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice.
Now, you spend a lot of time in the book digging deeply into two of Paul's letters.
Yes.
Romans and Galatians.
Yes.
Why did you choose those particular books,
right,
and what did you glean from them?
I chose those two because they're the ones where the theme of divine grace is most fully worked through, and I argued that the logic and the coherence of both Galatians and Romans is best understood from that perspective. But they're interestingly different in certain ways too. So I tried not to kind of sort of meld them into one another, but to take each on its own terms. And I think you can see a kind of progression as Paul's thought as it developed somewhat from Galatians with its very sharp and somewhat, it's very sharply antithetical style, to Romans, where we get a larger picture, the picture of Israel and the story of grace, if you like, in the whole picture of Israel, which in Romans 9 to 11 that you don't get, or only possibly just hinted at in the earlier letter to the Galatians.
It's interesting to think of Paul as a mind who could change or grow, as the works progress from one to another.
Yeah, I think Paul's a theologian, but I quite like to use the word, the verb. He does theologizing. That's to say, it's not a fixed. It's not arbitrary. There are certain constants, but he's always doing his theology for a purpose, for a context, for a situation, and so it's not entirely on the hoof in the sense that he's making it up, as it were, as he goes along. But it is also angled. It is also directed at particular situations, and I think that's the interesting thing about Paul's theology, that it moves, it develops, and then, of course, as Paul gets interpreted, that those developments on through Christian history are, as it were, kind of continuation of that same momentum.
Just as we must put Paul within his context, I think we need to put your book within its context too.
Right.
That it comes down into a discourse that has been marked by two major arguments: the New Perspective and what you call the Augustinian Reformation tradition.
Yeah.
How does your book fit within, or go beyond, or where do we place your book?
Right. Well, I'm hoping it actually gets us beyond that old dichotomy, which has arisen since the 1970s. The New Perspective arose as a kind of strong reaction against the Augustinian Lutheran tradition, and it particularly, the thing that I resonate with in the new perspective is trying to get away from old caricatures of Judaism or perceptions of Paul as somehow having kind of abandoned his former Judaism. And I want to understand Paul as a Jewish theologian among other Jews, but where I resonate with the Augustinian Lutheran tradition is in saying, the core thematic that drives the theology of both Galatians and Romans is the theology of grace. Mm-hmm. What the new perspective had sidelined because it thought Paul was just saying the same as fellow Jews, there was nothing distinctive or interesting about Paul here. I've kind of tried to put back in the picture and have tried to argue that what justifies and supports his Gentile mission is this understanding of the Christ gift as an unconditioned, incongruous gift. So I resonate with the new perspective and its emphasis on Paul's desire to create communities. It's not just about individuals.
Right.
And also with its emphasis that Paul's theology is done in and for the Gentile mission. But I'm asking the question, well, what really drives, what's the motivating drive for that Gentile mission theologically? And that's when, lo and behold, that central dynamic that Augustine and Luther and Calvin and so on, that central thread in Paul that they tugged on so hard, that really is a core structuring feature of Paul's thought.
Before we end the interview, I cannot resist the opportunity to ask you about what's next, because I understand it's something fairly exciting that is quite closely related to Paul and the Gift.
Yes, when I started writing on this project, I always intended to discuss both divine gift or grace and human gift, human gifts at the human level, how gifts are reciprocated in Paul's social ethics. And then this book grew into a task of its own. So the second part of it is going to be asking about how Paul figures human gift giving, the importance of reciprocity within that. In other words, still raising questions about our modern notion of the one-way unilateral gift, but asking also theologically what difference does it make to human gifts, human level gift reciprocity, that it's always triangulated, as it were, by relation to God as the giver of the gift, as the original giver of the gift, and as the one to whom we return thanks, and so on. So there's it's both a kind of social historical project about how in the ancient world people thought about gift reciprocity, and what we find in the Pauline letters, this time not just Romans and Galatians, but across the whole Pauline corpus, what we find about how Paul figures gifts, human gifts, and the gifts of the Spirit, and the whole dimension of gifts within Paul's relationships with his churches, but also asking about what difference it makes that it's, as I say, triangulated by reference to God. I'm actually quite interested in the kind of contemporary social and political dimensions of this as well, because a lot of the disputes that we currently have about welfare systems, about immigration and so on, I think can be well approached or better approached if we think of this in terms of gift and reciprocity. But
indeed,
watch this space. Yeah.
Many practical applications for that, and it sounds, well, I can't wait.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, John, so much for talking with us today.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
The book again is Paul and the Gift by John Barclay.